Okay, here we go. This is the one you've been waiting for. Now, what is Alex going to drop on us now? Oh, some more drama, I expect. Well, yes. So, hi, I'm Alex S. Johnson, aka Candy Fontaine. I'm an author, editor, and publisher with Nocturnicorn Books. And some of the people that I've worked with and published include Ramsey Campbell, John Shirley, Jerbo, David J. Haskins, Caitlin R. Kiernan, Poppy Z. Bright, David Niall Wilson, Carmela Voyez, Lyric Clark Rivera, Iris Berry, Ellen Mabey, Emily Frank, Richard Modiano, Jeffrey Thomas, Anna Taborska, Lee Bales, Michael A. Kobe, Nicole H. Six, Lucy Taylor, Paula D. Ash, Sumiko Salson, um, and Ethan Maroulis, Carrie Lee Crum. So Graham Masterton wrote the foreword to our William S. Burroughs series of literary tributes. I've published original work by Joe Pulver, the great Joe Pulver. I've been endorsed by people like Ray Garton, Lucy Taylor, Sandy DeLuca. I've collaborated with and published original work by, um, and I've also worked with, let's see, so besides Sandy DeLuca, our book Thunderstruck, a dark poetry collection, got a rave review in Cemetery Dance. Also been endorsed by people like Brian Keene, Alex S. Johnson is Bizarro, John Shirley. I've interviewed and I've published original work by John Shirley. Alex S. Johnson is the Baudelaire of our time. I was compared to Kathy Acker by none other than Are You Serious, who was the co-founder of Mondo 2000 magazine. And my work has also been endorsed by Patti Smith, uh, and Bill Plimpton, who's the Academy Award nominee, and the guy who did the face and is known for the couch gag on The Simpsons. And I've also interviewed people like published interviews with people like Diamanda Gallis and Krista Faust, King Diamond, Lemmy, Ronnie James Dio, and Alex Webster from Cannibal Corpse. Um, all the Motorhead guys. I've published interviews with David J. Haskins from Bauhaus, is also one of my authors. Peter Murphy, also at Bauhaus and Dolly's Car. And I've also appeared on the John Majori on Bowie's show. And I've been interviewed by Are You Serious, who compared me to Kathy Ecker. I've also published Ken Goffman, aka Are You Serious, his interview with me, and I published his interview with Kathy Acker. And so let's see, where do I begin? So the subject of my little, it's not a rant really, but it's sort of like you know, I want to hold the members of HWA accountable, the administration accountable for things they've actually done, not um, drama, not, baseless, groundless accusations. I want to talk about actual, actual serious, behavior transgressions by people who should know better, who are full-grown ass adults. And so again, the people who actually endorse me, support me, and have I published and interviewed Billy Martin, aka Poppy Z. Bright, Caitlin R. Kiernan, John Shirley, Christy Nogle, David Niall Wilson. It was the former, I published original work by David Niall Wilson, who is the former um, uh, president of Horror Writers Association. And Bram Stoker award-winning author. I've been published alongside Joe Hill, Ramsey Campbell, Kathy Tasick, Michael Arnzen, Tom Piccirilli, Wayne Allen Sally, Angela Rica Smith, and Allen Ginsberg, Charles Bukowski. And so Jack Mitchell-Line, William S. Burroughs, and Kathy Acker. I've also published conversations between Clive Barker and William Gibson, and an interview with Clive Barker, and an interview that I did with Diamanda Gallas and then Kim Adenizio. I've also interviewed Kim Adenizio. So I've got fingers in multiple pies. What I want to talk about now is more like how HWA, an organization that started out, being something that I was just very, very, you know, looked up to these authors. I met Ramsey Campbell in 1994. I met Poppy Z. Bright in 1994. Had extensive correspondence with Poppy Billy and, interviewed them. And I interviewed Caitlin R. Kiernan. Um, and I've interviewed Nancy Kilpatrick. I interviewed who, God, tons of people. Krista Faust. I signed with Murray Alexander at Dark Delicacies. I recently had Del Howes on my show, and I'm endorsed by people like Mort Castle, who said, "You're doing important work, Alex." So all the receipts are, and I was formerly a friend of, and interviewed, and published original work alongside original work by Ramsey Campbell. So, all of the receipts in terms of serious legitimacy in both, post-punk beat, publishing with Jarbo, publishing Jarbo, collaborating with Carrie Crum, who, was the founder, songwriter for a little band called The Runaways, publishing original work by David J. Haskins, who, if you guessed, Bela Lugosi's dead, yeah, that was his. So, John Shirley, who's also songwriter for a little band called Loyster Cult, and wrote the screenplay to a little film called The Crow, featuring music by, Nine Inch Nails and The Cure. Um, so, so this is Stoker Night, and for years and years and years, I was like, wow, I'd really love to have a Stoker Award, at least a nomination, at least the long list. I was actually a juror on the with the novels, of jury for for with HWA when I was with HWA, and was a full member a full member of HWA, dues paying member of HWA, and I was actually for a decade. And I was joined up in 1991. So I have a huge number of, Bram Stoker Award, either, award winners or nominees, including Benjamin Adams. Michael H. Hansen has been recognized, for his work with the Risling Awards. He's been nominated for a Risling Award. Anna Taborska is one of my closest friends, has been nominated like 6 or 7 times for Stoker as a World Fantasy Award finalist, Risling Award finalist, and multiple Bram Stoker Award winner. And, I published original work by her more than once. So one of my best friends. And I've also, interviewed people like Priya Sharma. Um, and this is not something that I'm happy about. I'm not happy to have to say, discouraging things about HWA, but there's this long history of people, whether it's, marginalized people, alphabet, people, queer people, neurodivergent people, underrepresented, you know, um, minorities or non-binary authors or trans authors or whatever, who just simply have not been recognized officially by the Stokers. And in fact, this is just verifiable history, and you can look it up. You have people like Brian Keene, and Samiko Salson actually saying, what's up with like, you guys don't recognize, marginalized authors. In fact, you had, people like Thomas F. Monteleone actually doing a live stream on Facebook, you know, saying incredibly racist and like horrible things about a non-binary author. So what the hell is wrong with this picture? You had David A. Riley for years, who's a friend of like Ramsey Campbell, and he was recognized. Thomas Monteleone was actually a Lifetime Achievement Award winner with the Stokers until he did um that ghastly live stream, and then even still, he had his supporters, and people are like, "What's wrong with Thomas Monteleone?" Well, shit, a lot of a lot of stuff. I was like, back in the '90s, I was like contributing editor to Death Realm magazine, which won the International Horror Critics Guild Award. I collaborated with Fear magazine, which won the British Fantasy Award. And I was actually featured in Fear magazine. So, yes, you can just, I don't have to, rationalize my credibility or my ethos with horror because I've been doing this for 30 years. I've been published by Poppy Bright, back in the early days of the Purple Prose uh, newsletter. I was published by Poppy. So, I've also interviewed people like John Skipp and Craig Spector, J.G. Faherty recently, Dale Howison of Dark Delicacies, recently Peaches Christ. I've interviewed Peaches Christ of, who else? T.L. James Glenn. I just did an interview with T.L. James Glenn, the sword and sorcery guy and actor and, fencer and, sword master and whatever. And I really like these people. I really dig these people. They're friends of mine. A lot of them are just like really solid, wonderful people, especially like shout out to Priya Sharma, shout out to Anna Taborska, shout out to Sandy DeLuca, you guys, I love you guys, Um, I really wish I didn't have to do this, but it's not about, people like Billy Martin or Caitlin Kiernan or Shirley or whomever, Christy Nogle or David Niall Wilson or John Palisano is a real good friend of mine. I'm talking about this pattern, the institutional pattern that is endorsed and supported really, really bad behavior and is ignored and overlooked things that should not be overlooked and ignored. And you know, if I were a marginal fringe figure, if I was, say, somebody who, had no credibility or didn't have any institutional or, critical support, and a Tambor, Alexis Johnson is a poet even when he's writing prose. He's a finalist for the World Fantasy Award. Okay, that's pretty significant. Uh, if I didn't have any credibility, if I hadn't been published alongside Joe Hill, for example, or say, Patrick Califia, or Michelle T, or, Kate Bornstein or whatever, or Ginsburg or, Burroughs, you know, I wouldn't be making this video, but it's because I do have this whole 30-year history that I feel I have the right to speak my piece, and Brian Keene can say what he has to say. I have the right to say what I have to say. And I've also been published alongside Brian Keene. And I've also been endorsed by Brian Keene. Alex S. Johnson is Bizarro. So, you know, this Brian Keene is also the guy who finally, banned, Christopher B. Pelton for life from Scares That Care. Now, my previous uh, YouTube live streams that I've done, had to do with, say, Angela Eureka Smith and Pixie Bruner, Joe Meinhardt, Ramsey Campbell, and Casey Hill and Janie Richter. And I'm pointing out that what began as, you know, friends of mine, people that I'd, published alongside Angela Rico Smith. I published alongside Angela and back in the, H. Poetry Showcase, Volume 3, alongside people like Michael Arnzen and Michael H. Hansen, you know, that that was we were friends, and I had actually appeared two times, two times on Angela's Opportunities Press program with Pixie Bruner. And so, she'd interviewed me and I read my poetry and performed my poetry alongside Pixie Bruner, who had actually initially approached me and was trying to impress me by saying that she was compared to, you know, um, Diamanda Gallis. And I've actually interviewed Diamanda Gallis. So, um, but what's the point? Well, the point is that I'm not talking from an outsider place. I'm not talking from insider place. I'm not talking from a bitterness place or resentment place. I'm not talking from a place that's like, well, he couldn't get into whatever, so he's bitter and he's resentful or whatever. Talking from perspective of somebody who's been published alongside these people and appeared on their shows and performed my work with them. Okay, Pixie Bruner, Angela Eureka Smith. I published original work by Paula Diash and edited them. And so, you know, every single one of the people who've been detractors of mine, I've endorsed, supported, gotten them positions, and they turned on me. So, but you have to have clout and you have to have a platform. You have to have, a position in order for people to, you know, to turn on you. Otherwise, it's just you have you have an initial relationship, and the initial relationships were doing fairly well up into a certain point. Now, what happened 2 years ago was Christopher B. Pelton. Christopher B. Pelton is sort of like a Mark Twain story, something like out of Kafka or Gogol or whatever. He arrives in town, or Melville, he arrives in town. He's kind of like this con artist, right? He's like, hey, I'm Chris Pelton. I'm the 420, the Snoop Doggy Dogg guy. I'm the joints kind of guy. I'm like real cool, man. And he's sort of like all over the place. He had a YouTube show for a long time, and he would, started interviewing people, and he started publishing people and saying, "Oh, I'm going to publish you. I'm going to publish you and platform you." So I saw a steady stream of attrition from people who had been friends of mine, who all of a sudden they're, whom I published, such as Josh Darling, for example, who all of a sudden who's saying, "Hey, you're some sort of rock star. I'd really like to publish you." Yeah, they really like to publish. And then I start to see, well, they get sucked into the vortex of Chris Pelton. Now, initially, a lot of people seem to like him, and it's had a lot of, whenever I was even slightly critical, I pointed out that, for example, his whole look, having the stovepipe hat and this kind of, this Dr. Caligari look. I said, that's a secondhand, like, appropriation. You know, you've ever seen Conrad Veidt in Dr. Caligari, the original Dr. Caligari, the German Expressionist classic, then you'd understand where Rob Zombie got his Living Dead Girl shtick, But people are saying, when I pointed out that it was the Rob Zombie, Caligari rip, I was like, how dare you? How dare you? I said, well, it's true. And he got a lot of young women he brought on board with Psychotoxin Press, and people were just gaga about him. He eventually started, kind of trying to get some of my authors that endorsed me, and I published, like John Shirley on his side, even Sumiko Salson, which just blows my mind because Sumiko Salson, would not, who I had gotten on board with HorrorAddicts.net. insisted at some point that I was a transphobe and just a real bad customer. And, I wind up being accused of all kinds of shit. I like actually tried to get them on board, Nocturnicorn books and published, but and I actually had a little meeting with them and their partner, which I asked about their pronouns. So it's not like I'm going around saying, accusing people of being, of saying bigoted things. I have no history at all of saying bigoted things. But who does? Pelton. Who's allied themselves with bigots, Paula Diaz. It's an uncomfortable fact. I mean, you have Paula Diaz publishing with James Ward Kirk, who was a MAGA and publicly endorsed J.K. Rowling. You also had Eric LaRocca being published by, if you guessed James Ward Kirk, you would be correct. So this is hypocrisy upon hypocrisy upon hypocrisy. So more matter, and less talk. Okay, what do you want to talk about, Alex? All I just want to say is that the HWA has a consistent history of platforming and supporting and indulging really bad guys and not so much endorsing or platforming or supporting people who are, transgender or gay or lesbian or bisexual or, of other non-white races. In fact, they had, Thomas Monteleone for years, and he was consistently saying the same things. It was because there was a public outcry and not because the leadership wanted to you know, um, kick him out. There was a public outcry. There was an entire Stoker cycle that happened before he was finally kicked out over resistance. And you just imagine how things are still really, there's a little bit more there's a lot more recognition, ironically, of people like Paula Diaz and Eric LaRocca, for example, but have also been published alongside Eric LaRocca. So, and I tried to get Eric LaRocca on board of the Clive Barker book. I said, look, we've got Poppy Z. Bryant, we got Caitlin Kiernan, we got, running the introduction, et cetera, et cetera. You love Clay Barker. He totally ghosted me. And I tried several times. I even posted it in public. I tagged him and people noticed, and people like Benjamin Adams, shout out to Benjamin Adams, noticed that he wasn't, he just was not responding at all. Obviously, he saw that stuff. Why did he not respond? Paula D. Ash. So you get the people who have a vested interest in covering up their associations with bad guys. James Ward Kirk, no longer with us, a bad guy. How do we know? Because I mean, he was going to publish the part three of my Floppy Shoes Apocalypse Clown Horror series until he deleted me on Facebook because he said you're picking on my guy Trump. Well, okay, so Paula Ash, how are you proud of being published by a guy who openly endorses Trump, right? So I'm not making anything up. I mean, you can look at this up for yourself. And so I'm saying while people are justifiably proud of themselves for, like the Stoker Awards, they have a history, of endorsing people who are, bad guys, giving lifetime achievement awards to bad guys, platforming people like David Riley, who was literally a fucking fascist. You had all sorts of, triangulation against queer authors and non-white authors. Billy Martin is still not been acknowledged with a full Stoker, you know. Uh, so what's that all about? So the old guard is still kind of, you know, intransigent, and but's worse, you have queer authors who are attacking other queer authors and hoping that nobody notices the hypocrisy and the contradictions between their stances and their when they have a platform, when they have nominations such as Paula Diaz, for the Stoker Award or Sumiko Salson, you know, like weaponizing their sudden clout, such as it is, against other alphabet authors, you know, that is really hypocritical. And we should all be working together to support each other and our beloved genres of horror, because the more we support one another, the more we can feel clean about, the message, the message that we give to the bigger community about, about what HWA is and about what you know, horror is and what horror is all about. It's right now there's even a perception, there's a general perception within horror that it was a shit show. And I'm sorry, it's just like I've talked to so many people, who either won awards, been Bram Stoker Award nominees, Bram Stoker Award former presidents, who are friends of mine, like John Palisano, saying, we got some problems. We had Nancy Kilpatrick, the late Nancy Kilpatrick, that I collaborated with and published alongside, who was the head of the grievance committee, and so was Hal Bodner, who I've also is a friend of mine, and I also published, an interview with Hal Bodner, which is up on uh, his website. So shout out to Hal Bodner. Hal Bodner was also head of the grievance committee, and they couldn't get accomplish anything because there was so much institutional resistance to any sort of change or reform. And they, so in summary, congratulations to all the nominees, congratulations to the winners. I don't have anything against you, and I hope, may the best people win. What I'm just saying is just like, please, if you're going to attack people, attack the real bad guys. Don't attack people like me who are trying to do some good, who've been in the business for decades. I'm just trying to, you know, raise some awareness about some objectively really horrible shit. And so don't shoot the messenger. Look to yourself. Look at the person in the mirror and say, hey, am I doing all I can to support my fellow authors, or am I a coward? Am I deliberately making misstatements, Jeannie Richter, Casey Hill, Angela Eureka Smith, lying about, you know, me essentially, because they can't handle the fact that I exposed their connections with real bad guys. Paula Diaz published with a real bad guy, and everybody knew about it. So it's like, well, oh, James Ward Kirk published Alessandro Manzetti, so Alessandro Manzetti publishes all these other people, and we can't criticize anybody who's already, he's a Bram Stoker Award winner, does Independent Legions, he's published Poppy Z. Bright. Why publish Poppy Z. Bright if you're going to publish, drawings and illustrations of pre-transition Poppy Z. Bright, pre-Billy Martin Poppy Z. Bright? I don't understand that, but I published alongside Alessandro Manzetti. Some of my best friends have been published alongside, with Alessandro Manzetti. So this I'm just like, what the hell, man? Let's just get it together and stop, you know, being cowards, and stop triangulating against each other, and really support each other, and kind of get more, palsy with it. So, you know, squeezins, love y'all so much. And please let's stop the bullshit.